We're talking about, guys, today we're talking about Atlanta. I like the way you move. Bum, bum, bum. I'm gonna sound like an old person, but like rock and roll. She literally gave me a stack because it is the month of love. Book friends, we're back with another book stop. This week's book stop is in Atlanta, Georgia. I went to Atlanta, I want to say in 2023. I should really check that. Let's check. And every time I go to anywhere, I try and find a bookstore that I can visit. I usually try and find 2, sometimes 3. Atlanta is a very big city and the bookstores are far away from each other, and I was only able to get to one. I definitely want to go back and go visit the other bookstores because they have, 1, a lot of bookstores, and 2, pretty diverse independently owned bookstores, which makes me excited because those places usually have the best recommendations for books that I would never have thought of or heard of just being online or going to like a Barnes and Noble, because I love a Barnes and Noble. I know that they're like the big box guy. They're the original big box guy who pushed out a lot of smaller bookstores, but today they're kind of like a remnant of my teenage years, and I have like a nostalgic little place in my heart for them. But with that said, most of the things that they highlight are popular books that I could also find online. Like really niche, diverse reads are coming from your smaller independent bookstores. The bookstore that I went to is one of those places. It's called Charis. The bookstore is in Decatur, Georgia. It's in this little wooden house with like a purple front door. It's got an old southern porch where they've got seating out there. It's very cute. It is definitely progressive. It's labeled as a feminist bookstore. So they're super inclusive, and also they have a lot of events that embraces kind of youth community. For instance, by the time this video comes out at the end of the month, they will have just had a youth board game afternoon, 4:30 p to 6:30 p. Super cute. I want to go to a youth board game event. They have an event almost every day, and some of them, I mean a lot of them, are lectures by authors, which makes sense, right? Because it's a bookstore and most bookstores do that. But they also just have like community meeting type things, and I love that when bookstores get involved in things that are just third space kind of things where people can come together and play some board games. They have youth groups, they have parenting groups. A majority of this, if not all of this, looks to be free. The person running the store when I went that day gave me some really good book recommendations. Usually when I go to a store and I ask for a book recommendation, they might give me like 1 or 2, and she literally gave me a stack. And I think she gave me more than this, but this is what I chose to buy. She was like, if you want a recommendation, I'm giving you a recommendation. Buy all of them. She was doing her job. I picked up one myself because I was just reading and it looked good, and I'm so happy that I picked this book up. For Black History Month and for the month of February, because it is the month of love, every single one of these books is by a Black author, and a lot of it talks about social change that could benefit Black communities, or it's just talking about the Black experience. The amount of love that is filled in all of these books, regardless of what they're about, is immense. Like, it's approaching community activism and social progress from a place of love, from a place of loving yourself, from a place of loving your community, from a place of loving the marginalized, and the opportunity that you have when you know this is all going to end, and you really can spread as much love as possible to the people around you, and how much love has been necessary for communities of color to survive in this country. There's so much gratitude for elders and community in having saved people. The first book that I got from the bookstore was by Hanif Abdurraqib. They Can't Kill Us Until They Kill Us. This was the book that I actually started reading while I was still in Atlanta. So usually when I go to a bookstore, I buy a few books. During dinner, I will start reading one of the books. At first glance, and I read through the first few chapters, it is a bunch of essays written by a music critic. Hanif seems to have been in the music scene, or in the American music scene, for many years. He was one of those music lovers who would like go to all the concerts, who would drive to another state to go see certain bands in concert. He knew a lot of bands before they were big and popular, and was part of kind of the inception crowd of some really popular names and names that didn't become so popular. He writes a little bit about kind of just like his experience being attached to music in a way that was foundational for him. It felt like it wasn't just his identity, but his experience as a young Black kid in America, and his mechanisms for survival included music that existed in spaces that did not always care about his survival. Like, he was existing in community with groups, especially when you get into some of the genres that he liked when he was younger, that was like metal, punk. I'm gonna sound like an old person, but like rock and roll. It wasn't rock and roll. This was the Fall Out Boy era, I suppose. This was My Chemical Romance. This was, I think we're about the same age. Into his young 20s, he was very much part of the punk rock scene in the Midwest. He's from Ohio. I was reading this originally kind of from the lens of like that movie Almost Famous, of that young guy who like really wanted to be a Rolling Stone magazine writer. I put it down after I left Atlanta. And then last year, after I lost my son, I was reading to retain my sanity, and I was trying to focus on less complex stories. I read some very well written children's books, and I read Hanif's book. The children's books ended up being about a mother who lost her son. Hanif's book ended up being about grief in a lot of different ways. Grieving friends that he lost to drug use or just the pain of being alive. He lost his mother, which you end up finding out there is a sharing of grief that goes on in his writing that's based in so much love, that is based in so much hope that he can make it through and still retain the softer pieces of himself that you feel like you lose when you lose people. And it's one of the books last year that kept me alive. I feel like in my life, books have found me in a place and time where I needed them to find me. We met each other in the space that we should have met each other at. And even besides all of that, the writing in this book is fantastic. They're small essays put together. There's little kind of Marvin Gaye. The book is held together by time and like experience, but also with these little vignettes about Marvin Gaye, whose story is also very heartbreaking. Follow him on social media. Everything that he writes is so nuanced and with such a unique point of view. You should read this if you like condensed stories, because they're little stories within a larger story. It's a really quick read. It is 300 pages, but it's smaller than your average book. If you like essayists or you're into memoir, just good. It's one of the best books that I've read in years. And I just got his new book that he just wrote that's about sports. I have it somewhere. There are books that come into your life that just touch you, and this is one of them. The next book that I got was We Do This Till We Free Us. It's by Mariame Kaba, Abolitionist Organizing and Transforming Justice. This again is already published works. These are individual essays, which can also feel like it reads really quickly. It's less than 200 pages, but something about reading an essay, like you can just do one essay at a time. Some of these are direct commentary about the idea of abolishing the prison system. Some of it is about organizing, and some of it is about the ideology around why these institutions should not exist and the real harm that is done to the communities that they exist in. Obviously, most often to marginalized groups. In this particular instance, she's directly talking about Black Americans, but she also includes the marginalized in America in general who end up getting swept into these places, and the factual data that exists that basically says that they don't deter in any appreciable way future crime. She's making an argument, as has been made in a lot of public spaces the last few years, over why this shouldn't exist. Now, if you are the type of person who has heard about police or institutional imprisonment abolition and you don't understand what that means, or you're like, what do you mean get rid of the police? Like, what if somebody's breaking into my house? Who am I gonna call? This addresses what they're actually talking about, because I feel like publicly there's been like these conversations that are like, that's ridiculous and also sounds scary. It's been a lot of like extremist rhetoric that's not actually the thing that's being talked about. This makes it plain, and you can understand and agree or disagree by the end of it, whether or not you think that it's something that can actually exist in our world. Now, whether or not it should exist, I feel like isn't a question because of how horrendous the prison system is. But the fact that some form of punishment system is going to exist is a reality. And so what is the point of like spending this energy and time and having these discussions when the reality is I don't see it going away? But this is talking about a future in which it can and should. I think thinking about those things is important. Why should you read this? Just to understand the concept more. Like, you can start there. And I want to understand what's the point of thinking these things that feel impossible. There's a chapter towards the end that says community matters, collectivity matters. I think even just the embracing of your community is a start, because so often we create these systems, or we think that these structures should exist for this scary other, for these scary criminals, for the bad guys. But prisons hold everybody. Prisons hold the people who are addicted to drugs, and the petty thieves, and the people who have committed white collar crimes, and everything in between. And so many times those groups of people exist in our own community. They exist in our own families. Like, if you had to build a structure that was for your people, what would you want it to look like if this didn't exist? And I think that asking yourself that question makes you realize that a lot of these things really do need to change. Next is emergent strategy. I'm going to talk about these two together: emergent strategy and pleasure activism. By that little blue book right there, there are the Octavia Butler books, Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talents. It was written in the 90s. It's a story about basically post-apocalyptic America. There's some reference to other countries, but it's really focusing on America and the condition that this country is in after global warming, after an epidemic of people addicted to prescription drugs whose side effect ended up being a kind of form of pyromania, and they start setting the country on fire. Particularly, it takes place in California. You're post like the dismantling of a lot of normal society, and people in survival mode, and communities that have come together to figure out a way to survive, while there are huge swaths of Americans that are impoverished to the point where there's gangs of homeless people everywhere that are harming citizens who still have something, but they're harming them from a place of absolute desperation. They have nothing left. There are no societal structures that are still intact left to help them. And the monstrously rich are living behind huge walls with guards and dogs. It's kind of like an extreme version of where Octavia Butler felt like the country could end up and would possibly end up. And so today, there's been a lot of conversation about her book because it takes place in 2024, and so many things feel like they're happening right now. The leader who shows up to try and like fix everything is this far-right Christian who's taken up Ronald Reagan's slogan of "Make America Great Again." And so it feels like creepy that there are these similarities. I, again, went to the bookstore in 2023. These were written 2019 and 2017. We feel right now like, oh my God, Octavia Butler was telling the future. The reality is, like, these themes and these fears have existed forever for the marginalized and people of color in this country. And this conversation has been happening. But I just found it so interesting that I've had these books sitting and I haven't really gotten into them. And then right now, in the midst of all of this, I pick them up, and these two are in conversation with Octavia Butler. Like, who would have thunk? This one's more in conversation with Octavia Butler. This one's in conversation directly with Parable of the Sower. In that book, there's a religion that they end up following that's basically God is change. This kind of romanticizing of a God, a benevolent father who is going to kind of take care of you and fix everything for you, is pointless. The only real constant in life is change. And if you accept that, then you can move with change and you can harness change. You can take your responsibility for the things that you are doing and the way that you're showing up in community, and you can help change the world for the better. This particular book is talking about emergent strategy. I'm going to read directly from it so that I don't like butcher it. Emergence is the way complex systems and patterns arise out of a multiplicity of relatively simple interactions. In the framework of emergence, the whole is a mirror of the parts. Existence is fractal. The health of the cell is the health of the species and the planet. There are examples of emergence everywhere. Birds don't make a plan to migrate. raising resources to fund their way, packing for scarce times, mapping out their pit stop. They feel a call in their bodies that they must go, and they follow it, responding to each other, each bringing their adaptations. Emergence is beyond what the sum of its parts could even imagine. It's destiny. Oak trees don't set an intention to listen to each other better or agree to hold tight to each other when the next storm comes. Under the earth always they reach for each other. They grow such that their roots are intertwined and create a system of strength that is as resilient on a sunny day as it is in a hurricane. It's this idea that human beings should be behaving more like the nature around us. In trying to find solutions, we should be looking to nature. The most simplistic idea is dams. Into looking for water management solutions in your city, the best example was beavers and dams, and that's what human beings have turned to, and they've been wildly effective. And in fact, in some places where they haven't been able to create dams themselves, man-made dams, there have been beavers who've made better dams than people. She references an Octavia Butler quote: "Civilization is to groups what intelligence is to individuals. It is a means of combining the intelligence of many to achieve ongoing group adaptation." She references her a lot, then has like some very explicit ways for being able to practice this. There's a whole part at the back that gets into like exercises. It's much more kind of like how to, what to do. I think that a lot of it is applicable to larger world change, but also, especially if you're in a leadership position, it is a good way to get some tools around people working together better for the good of the whole, because offices can tend to be like a toxic space if people are not in community with one another, because you're like squished together for way too much time and it can get really uncomfortable. So you have to foster that sense of community. Why you should read it: if you want to understand some of the concepts that everybody's talking about around Octavia Butler's books and the ideology that felt so appealing that came from those books, check this out. If you want some real strategies that you could use for building community, building more natural and healthy community, check this out. Like I said, this one's kind of in conversation with Octavia Butler. It's pleasure activism. It is this idea. Pleasure activism feels like a kind of sexual type thing because pleasure is tied to sex in this country very closely. There's a lot of conversation early on about the erotic, but not erotic as pornography. And they argue that actually pornography is the farthest thing from the erotic because it is this farce. It's not real pleasure. The ideology seems to be in this book that as a human being, if you experience real pleasure in all facets of your life, in the sense of like a deep yes, this job that I have is what I want to be doing, this way that I'm living is how I want to be living, and it doesn't have to be extravagant, it just sort of embracing of and enjoyment of the things in your life. That includes your sex life, but that is not what they're focusing on. They're talking about an embracing and a joy in everything. And again, I feel like most of these books are about that, of love, loving enough to be set free. And so if you are happy and you are loved and you are beloved and you are loving, it's impossible for you to take negative energy into the world and harm others. You are trying to find ways for the bettering of all because you yourself are so full of these good things that you want to spread into the world. I love the idea, and I also believe it very much. Like the whole hurt people is a thing. If you are happy in your life and enjoying your family and not hating going to work, I promise you, you move in the world very different than somebody who's miserable. People who you work with who mistreat other people and who come in with a certain bad attitude all the time, I promise that you can trace that directly to something going on in their life that is making them unhappy. The happier people are, the better they are to other human beings. The more included that you feel in community, the more you will want to be inclusive in your community. It is starting at the beginning and spreading out to the whole. So there's care as pleasure, there's sex as pleasure, there's performance as pleasure, there's community as pleasure, and she has a lot of essays in here from other activists who thought the same way. One of the beginning chapters is a famous essay by Audre Lorde, The Erotic is Power, and how this idea that we're taught to suppress the erotic because we derive so much power from it. And there's a highlighted portion that she says is basically the whole thing that this whole book is trying to reveal. The erotic is a measure between the beginnings of our sense of self and the chaos of our strongest feelings. It is an internal sense of satisfaction to which, once we have experienced it, we know we can aspire. require. For having experienced the fullness of this depth of feeling and recognizing its power in honor and self-respect, we can require no less of ourselves. It's not only how we end up moving in the world, but it's also what we'll accept. We're not going to accept being mistreated. We're not going to accept being abused because we know that there's a different way to live. If you want to learn about pleasure activism and read something that's in conversation with the parable of the sower and Octavia Butler's ideas, then this is a really good one. It's longer, but it is written in separate essays. It doesn't feel so overwhelming. All these books feel very pleasurable. Like this is a tactile experience. The last two are both by Kiese Laymon. This is a collection of essays. This is his memoir. He is a writer from Mississippi. He writes about the Black male experience in the South. I started this one. This one's like a little over 100 pages and I want to finish it in one day. It's so good. He opens this during COVID, and that's really interesting because the experience of the COVID years, I don't like reading COVID fiction. COVID as horror, it's not for me. COVID as political experience and what it meant for different groups of people, I'm down with. That's where he starts, but then he gets into how the rest of his life just was leading up to that version of that experience because he was a fat Black man from Mississippi. And so that's also the kind of theme in his memoir. 2 stories in, I'm so traumatized because he is talking about the life of a child with a parent who was gone a lot and the experiences in the margins of this kind of life where you are cared for and very uncared for. I immediately had like PTSD from being young and some of the horrible things that were done, witnessed in those forgotten spaces of time. The amount of harm that gets done to kids is massive. That's what it's about so far. It's also about his grandmother, and I was raised by a grandmother, and the amount of love that you have for a grandmother that saves your life is never ending. And so I'm really excited to finish this one. You should read these if you like really good writing. He's a good writer, a really good writer. A lot of emotion and poetry in his writing. If you like memoir, I'm a memoir girl. I don't know if you guys have noticed this, or like as I get into more books that I actually love, you will notice more and more how many, I just love stories. I love people. I love people's stories. I love feeling seen in a story. I love feeling closer to the world in a story. I love knowing that we are all just trying to make it. Some are doing better than others. Some have different advantages, situations. Some have life experiences that I will never relate to, but even that is bringing me closer to them, understanding that we don't relate, but you're having an experience that's valuable. I just love stories of people. If you love stories of people, get these. All right, guys, that brings me to the end of my Atlanta book stop visits. Hoping to see other bookstores in Atlanta in the very near future. I have to go back up there probably sometime this year, so I'm excited about that. You guys will get to come with me, so I'm excited about that too. Like, subscribe, tell me what the next Atlanta bookstore is that I should go to. Which one is your favorite? Tell me when's the next bookstore anywhere that I should go to. If you have a really amazing bookstore that you love in your city, let me know. I will see you guys in the next one. Bye, guys. Oh, and happy Valentine's Day.